Taking us into the subject of revert or reform, Indonesia under Jokowi's second term, our moderator, Dr. Siwagi Dharmanegara, co-coordinator of Indonesia Studies Program with ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute, and his distinguished panelists, Dr. Zainal Abidin Bagir and Dr. Mari Pangestu. Dr. Siwagi, please.
Thank you, Evelyn. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoy the lunch. And for the interest of time, we will now continue to the third panel of today's Regional Outlook Forum 2020, entitled Revert of Reform, Indonesia under Jokowi's second term. And today it is my privilege to moderate this distinguished panel. We are extremely fortunate to have two Indonesian experts to share their views on the main political and economic challenges and opportunities facing Indonesia under Jokowi's second term. And as we all know, Indonesia is in the post-election phase now. So after a very divisive election in 2019, we know that President Joko Widodo now has won and continued on his second term, which is his last term. And he has announced his new cabinet in October last year, and many were made surprised with the choice of the member of the cabinet, including like some politicians, not only from the political parties that support the government, but also from the opposition. So some analysts believe that this is the way the president is trying to consolidate the power base, and but it's still too early to tell whether the cabinet will can work effectively in the next 5 years. So today our panelists will discuss what are the external and internal challenges and also opportunities faced by Indonesia, and how the government is trying to respond to those challenges and also to take advantage from the opportunities that arise. So we will also hear from the panelists about the key reform and also what are the ongoing economic transformation, what are the plans under the current government. So beyond the economic issue, we would also like to hear from our expert panel about the role of the religion and politics in today's Indonesia. Is Indonesia Islam once hailed as moderate, has become more conservative? And will the government be able to suppress this tendency? And how will Jokowi approach dealing with these conservative groups and others who may be critical to the government, affect future democracy in the country? So those are the key issues that we would like to discuss in this panel. And now it is my privilege to introduce our panelists. We have with us today Professor Mari Pangestu on my left. She served as Indonesia's Minister of Trade from 2004 to 2011, and as Minister of Tourism and Creative Economy from 2011 to 2014. And she is a Senior Fellow at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. She is also Professor of International Economics at the University of Indonesia and on the Board of Trustees of Center for Strategic and International Studies based in Jakarta. And for our second panelist, Dr. Zainal Abidin Bagir on my right. He's the Executive Director of the Center for Religious and Cross-Cultural Studies, Graduate School of Gajah Mada University based in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. He's also a board member of the Indonesian Consortium for Interreligious Studies, Yogyakarta. And his main interests relate to the issue of democratic management of religious diversity and religion and science. So format-wise, each speaker will be speaking for about 20 minutes. We will start with Professor Mari Pangestu, and then after that followed by Dr. Zainal. So after that, we will follow up with question and answer session. So now it is my pleasure to invite Professor Mari Pangestu to take the floor. Ibu, please.
Thank you very much, Wage, for your kind introduction. I'd like to thank the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies for inviting me to share my thoughts today on the economic challenges and priorities for President Joko Widodo's second term. And I just wanted to give a special appreciation to ISEAS, because I feel like I grew up as an economist, as a young researcher, when I was used to come in the 80s to ISEAS, and we did a lot of research projects where I met a lot of the ASEAN economists. So I hope you're still continuing those kind of programs. Let me just start with my main message in case I don't get time to finish my presentation. I decided to take a broad view of what is obviously a very big topic. And I think the main challenge for and priority for countries like Indonesia, given the current external uncertainties that we face and many disruptions that we face, is really how can we undertake the structural reforms that are needed and then attract the type of investments that we need to have to be able to go to the next level of development. And it's not just about the quantity of investment, but the quality of investments. And that's about, how do I become part of the global value chain? It's also about addressing sustainable development and climate change and so on. So why is that the case? I'm just going to go very quickly through the external context and responses that are needed, that the region has done, and obviously the domestic story, the domestic growth story. So if you look at the uncertainties in the global context, we could spend the whole day talking about this. But in summary, we all know about the economic slowdown, the tensions in trade, which is leading to weak trade demand. And the other two big disruptions that we are all facing is obviously technological transformation and climate change. And I added climate change deliberately because I do think we oftentimes, especially economists, we don't put climate change as one of the big uncertainty ahead of us. And if you look at, this is just to show you how dramatic the uncertainty has developed over just the last 2 years. So if you look at that sharp increase, that is actually January 2018 to now. So in 2017, even though Trump was already president, he was still just talking about doing things. He didn't actually do anything until January 2018. The moment he started slapping on tariffs and using security and so on as an argument, it increased 11 times. And the impact has been on trade growth as well as global economic slowdown. This is across the world, globally, and this is the picture for Southeast Asia, where all of us are experiencing a slowdown in growth. And in particular, Singapore, obviously, because of its openness nature, its dependence on trade and so on. Vietnam is the only country here that actually increased in Q3 2019. Indonesia doesn't look good, but doesn't look bad, as we say. 5%. We grow around 5%. And that's because we are a large country. We have a large domestic market. But if we wanted to grow higher, definitely we need to do reforms to be able to take advantage of more growth from trade and so on and so forth. And we know that China is actually the big thing for us. Global economic slowdown, uncertainty, yes, that's a big issue for us. But China has the most impact on our growth. 1% decline in the growth of China will lead to a 0.3% decline in our GDP growth. So that is related to the commodities and the demand and so on and so forth. So trade uncertainties are unlikely to be resolved soon. I think it's not rocket science. I'm not the only one saying this. The trade tensions that are between the US, China, on the trade in goods and tariffs is just the surface. what you're really seeing is a much deeper issue about how to deal with the rise of China and the fact that this is a US election year where anti-China, anti-trade is really bipartisan. It's not just a President Trump Republican issue. And within China itself, you also have the nationalists versus the reformists inside China as also affecting the way we are managing the US-China trade relations. So it's here for the long term. Uncertainty in trade, how are we going to deal with the new issues? How are we going to deal with the complex issue that we see coming out, the overlapping of economic, business, technology, and security interests in a multipolar world. See, there's a lot of adjectives in that sentence, but that in one sentence describes kind of the new normal that we have. There are new issues like IPR, how do we deal with data security and governance, and how do we deal with the increased protectionism. These are all issues that face us, and countries need to do reforms because it is part of what will happen anyway, and it's not just a China issue, it is an overall issue. And obviously, technology, digital economy, automation, AI, robotics taking over jobs, this is a big, big issue. There's on the one hand jobs being lost, but on the other hand, jobs being created. Where's the balance? But the difference, I was told, with this technological transformation compared to previous technology transformations is one, the speed. Second, the pervasiveness. In the past, a technological transformation would only affect a particular sector. But here you're talking about across the board. So this is one of the biggest challenges also facing countries. And Indonesia is one country that is facing this issue and asking itself, how do we change the education system? How do we change the issues with our labor law and so on and so forth? I wanted to say a final thing about the other big disruption, which we don't talk too much about, but which is actually, we feel it, yeah? Jakarta just had the really bad floods. We have the bushfires in Australia, so it's real. And it is affecting our country. It is, whatever happens in my country, I know also affects Singapore and Malaysia. And it's affecting the poorest part of our population as well, and it has a lot of impact on health, productivity, et cetera, et cetera. So this is just a picture to show you the source of CO2 emission in Indonesia. Yes, it is about the forest fires, the peatland decomposition, as well as the agriculture land use. But increasingly, energy and transportation is going to take over as the source of CO2 emission. So this comes from a commission that I'm involved in, where we need to intervene in each of these systems, whether it's the agriculture and land use, whether it's energy, whether it's waste management, and especially forest fire and peatland. These are all in need of interventions, which are actually new business opportunities as well. And this is a simulation that tells you if you actually did nothing, you're going to grow at 5% and then you're going to drop to 3% because of the cost that you're going to have to incur with the natural resource destruction. If you take into account the destruction of the natural resources, the reduction in productivity because of health from pollution, et cetera, you are going to have a much lower growth path. But if you did the other trajectory, which is the low carbon development scenario, where you actually intervene, you change from coal to renewable energy, you go improve your public transportation, you do something about the peatland restoration. Peatland and mangrove absorb carbon 4 times more than typical forest, right? So if you actually did this, it is so much, we think Indonesia could be actually a super carbon power, rather than right now we are getting, of course, a lot of very negative attention related to our palm oil and so on. So I think this is an opportunity both for Indonesia's quality of growth as well as new jobs, new sectors, which will actually help Indonesia in the long run. And uncertainties, we know, create threats and opportunities in trade and investment. So this whole uncertainty is causing disruption in global value chain. It's causing investors and companies to start thinking through, okay, how do I diversify my risk? How do I change where I source and put my production, and so on and so forth. On top of that, you have technological transformation that allows you to have more fragmented production. And where are we going on this is not something that I'm going to talk in detail, but I'm just going to show you one picture, which the reason we use this picture is because India is as part of this global value chain. We are kind of used to thinking about East Asia as Southeast Asia and Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan as being part of this global value chain in Asia. But what's happening is increasingly you could be having India as part of this global value chain, and at least in automotive, in this example, they're already part of it. And increasingly, services are going to be an important part of the global value chain. This is the future of how global value chains will evolve. And on top of that, when you see the uncertainties that are being created by the trade tensions, countries, companies are diversifying. And we don't quite know where this is going to end up. But if your country wants to attract the investment, and you want to be part of the new whatever it is going to be looking like, you better do some reforms. You better do your structural reforms, and you better do your homework about continuing the openness, which has been a very important part of the development of East Asia. So for the last 3 decades, East Asia has developed because we had a conducive world trade environment. We had the US leadership that kind of looked over the world economic order. Now, with all that no longer being part of our external environment, it's about time that we do something about it, so that we as ASEAN, we as East Asia, we need to show that because of this opportunity in trade and investment and global value chain, we need to continue the process of opening up. And I think maybe some of you follow it, but a lot of people don't follow it and don't think it's important. There was a little piece of good news at the end of last year when at least 15 countries agreed on the text of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which is 16 economies. India has not joined yet. And India not joining RCEP is different from the US leaving the TPP, right? If US left, if they want to come back, they have to renegotiate. India has not joined. It's just maybe they will join this year, maybe they need more time, but the opportunity for that to happen is still there. And that's the minus X principle of ASEAN. It's a practical, progressive approach. And guess what? RCEP is the biggest mega regional in the world today. It is half of the world's population. Even if you took India away, it's 30% of the world population. It's 30% of world trade and 32% of world GDP, and the figure is not there. It's also about 30% of world investment. So if we grow, if we continue, and this is the signal that happened, a positive signal that we saw last year, then I think we could be in good shape to continue the process of opening up. And if you recall the history and the experience of East Asia, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, when we do domestic structural reforms, it is always framed in our international commitments, whether it's the WTO or whether it's the regional commitments. That's why I'm a proponent of the regional, regional agreements being part of the framework for the domestic reforms. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to go very quickly on now the domestic story. President Jokowi has identified 5 priorities for national development, and a lot of that is about structural reforms, because basically all countries are facing this problem, that the limits to you using fiscal policy for stimulus is already hitting kind of a brick wall. Indonesia and it's not an exception. Revenue is coming down, and needs for infrastructure, needs for new capital are all absorbing the expenditure side, so that we have a limited room to use fiscal stimulus for growth. So therefore, you need structural reforms to boost private investment. Similarly with monetary policy, as we know, the room or space for monetary policy to provide stimulus with low interest rates is also now very limited. In fact, I think yesterday's Financial Times quoted Mark Carney, the governor of Bank of England, as saying, we may be in a liquidity trap, right? So therefore, where are you going to get your new sources of growth? It's only going to come from private investment and conducive government policy that will create the right kind of environment. And that's why the focus is infrastructure, human capital, deregulation, debureaucratization, simplification of the laws and regulations and reforms and economic transformation. So I think I only have 5 minutes left, so I'm just going to go very quickly through some of these slides. I think infrastructure has been relatively successful in the last 5 years, but if you look at deeper into the analysis of the infrastructure, we're only actually just catching up with what we didn't do for 10, 15 years during the Asian financial crisis. Yeah, so we're just catching up. And the other thing we did was to focus on Papua and Eastern Indonesia, which is the kind of equity spreading development kind of objective, but the economic impact will take more time, longer, to really bear fruit. So it is really the challenge about quality and financing. Most of this is also financed by the government and most involving state-owned enterprises. The question that we're all facing now, as the private sector especially, is asking, okay, when is the time for the more private sector involvement? And the signal seems to be that they would like to have more private sector involvement. But that requires you to have the right framework of private-public partnership and so on and so forth. And this is still, I think, we're still waiting to see. Most important issue that that most people ask us about, and I don't think I can give you a good answer, but the plan to move the capital city to Kalimantan, it is really about the president has, if you look at the last 5 years, been very concerned about spreading the economic growth outside of Java. Yeah, he's been quite focused on that. So it is partly that, and it is partly about how do we enhance equality and reducing Java-centric. And despite that, I think, of course, there's lots of issues that need to be addressed if you're talking about moving a capital city to an area which is not remote, but also not very well developed. So there's issues about legal basis, the master plan, the financing, and the environmental question. You know, in a way, you have an opportunity. You've got a blank page. You can build the most sustainable city if you planned it right. And how do you have the economic growth grow around it? Yeah, so I think that's still a lot of issues out there. But the president is very serious, very committed, and he intends for the beginning of something to be there by 2024. And he has been saying that I will be starting to go to the office in Kalimantan in 2024. But I think at least if you had the master plan and the basic infrastructure, maybe that's possible, but we have to wait and see. The other approach is using special economic zones. This is not new. This is what China did. We have now 17 special economic zones. They are sectoral and increasingly thinking about having ones on education as well as health. And again, regional development as well as, can we get around some of these complex laws and regulations by doing special economic zones. But I think, again, for me, as someone who actually passed the law on special economic zones back, I don't know how many years ago was that, 6 or 7 years ago, implementation is not easy, yeah? And having a one-stop service and a really proper, body of authority who's managing the special economic zone in a professional and private sector way is, I think, still not quite there yet for Indonesia. Human capital, big challenge. I think all countries have this big challenge, but Indonesia, because we are having to absorb 2 million new entrants into the labor force, 60% of our labor force is informal sector, and our underemployment, open unemployment is only like 5%, but underemployment means you work less than 40 hours a week. is about 30% or 40%, and most of it is in the youth and in the rural areas. So again, that can be a source of conflict, social tension, and so on. And the level of education is very low of our labor force. So I think that's the challenge for our new education minister. As you know, our president, I think Wage mentioned about cabinet. Our president has really been quite, I suppose, innovative. He has picked somebody young and somebody who started Gojek, a company which is like Uber, and he's the education minister. And he has been trying very hard to be very innovative and thinking through how can we have really short-term, medium-term, and longer-term program. We can, if you have questions later, we can discuss this. I just wanted to quickly finish on what is the way that we want to do reforms quickly, because I think the president has been very frustrated at the speed of change in regulations and laws and the bureaucracy. So what he's doing is he's coming up with this very ambitious deregulation, debureaucratization, and simplification and reform program, which is basically called the omnibus law. It's a very, I don't even understand what an omnibus law is, but you'd think it's just one law that covers everything. No, it's not. It's basically 82 laws and 101,094 articles in regulations and laws that will be changed. You know, they're in different laws, it's not one law, that will be changed at the same time, right? That's what it means. And so you're amending a number of laws or articles within a number of laws all at the same time. And there are two drafts, one for job creation and one for tax reforms. The one on job creation has 11 clusters. I can't go through every one of them, but it's about doing ease of doing business, simplifying licensing. Labor reform is the most difficult one politically, and that's the one I understand has been the most difficult for them to deal with. It is about minimum wage setting. It is about retrenchment, rigid retrenchment regulations that are now currently affecting our investment environment. And then there's maybe the interesting one is penalty. In the past, if you have a white-collar crime, it's considered criminal, yeah. And you can, instead of doing it in the commercial court, it's in the criminal court. So apparently, this is a request by the business sector. Finally, tax. Tax reform is probably the one that's actually gonna, I think, will happen, because the draft is already finished at the end of last year. And it is about increasing investment, territorial system for foreign earned income, and so on, encouraging voluntary tax payment and creating a fair and domestic business climate and facilities in the taxation law. Because taxation has been one of the major complaints about the investment climate. And they are also talking about tax incentives, tax holiday, tax incentive for special economic zone, super deduction for labor-intensive sectors, vocational training, and research. So if you invest in R&D, for instance, apparently you can get 200% or even 300% back as tax deductible. Tax incentive for regions and regional autonomy, and tax incentive and framework for financial instruments that's intended to deepen the financial system. And finally, reduction of corporate tax and for dividends. The plan, I haven't got my numbers here, is to reduce the corporate tax rate to 22% by 2021-22, and then to 20% by 2023, yeah? From 25% now. And then if you're a publicly listed company, you just minus 3% of that. So we're not very far from Singapore. Singapore is 17%, right? Yeah. So this is the intention, but it has to be accompanied, obviously, by improved administration and collection. I'm going to end here, even though I have some more slides, but I hope I've given you a flavor of what's being tried to be done. But as I think Wage emphasized at the beginning, that implementation, the devil is in the details, implementation, institutions, bureaucracy. These are still major challenges for us. But I think the intention is there to improve the investment climate. And even if we can maybe begin to achieve part of it and show that at least we're going in the right direction, I think that's all we can hope for in the short term. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ibu Mari. So next, let me invite Pak Zainal to start his presentation.
Sorry.
Yeah, first, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for inviting me in this prestigious forum. So we're going to move from the economic issues to mostly political issues and religion, which probably is exciting, but may also be frustrating. It depends on where you stand. These are a few issues which I want to address here. So in general, by way of introduction, in general, most observers, scholars, look at Indonesia as a majority Muslim country, which is moderate, democratic, but also with high internal diversity, even within Muslims, and in its political history is always contentious. So my main question is, looking at this backdrop, what do we see in the past few years and what we may see in the coming few years? The most recent context is, or most important context is the democratizations in 1998. There was democratization and then decentralization, but also the rise of ethnic and religious politics of identity. I will look at how does this affect Jokowi's second term, but I will start with giving some important historical background of religion and politics in Indonesia, and then look at the challenges during Jokowi's second term, as well as what are the prospects for the coming years. So a quick historical background. What we see today is nothing new at all. I mean, the involvement of religion in the public sphere, in politics, since very early in the independence days. Religion and politics have always been intertwined. And religion also, you see many political scientists which look at Islam in Indonesia. They see Islam in Indonesia as something different. A few years ago, it was usually mentioned together with Turkey as two Muslim majority democratic countries. And to some extent, probably now Indonesia is even better in the recent development. But the tensions within different religious groups have always been there. In 1945, there was a constitutional debate on Islam and the state. Part of the debate is whether Islam should be mentioned particularly in the constitution. And the same very similar debate came up again in 1955, and more recently, after the democratizations in 1998 during the constitutional amendment in 2000 to 2002, this debate came up again, and in all these debates, the nationalists always won. And when I say nationalists, actually most of the nationalists, they are also Muslims. So this is part of the internal diversity. And then during the Sukarno time, accommodation of Islam is very clear, for example, in terms of the establishment of the Ministry of Religious Affairs. And then during the time of Suharto, there was a mix of repression of Islamists and accommodations of the Muslim groups which are considered as moderates and no democracy. And it's very interesting if we see that this strategy of a mix of repressions and accommodation actually has been continued with different regimes. but with different designations of who are the moderates, who are the hardliners or Islamists. And we'll see that in Jokowi as well. But before that, after 1998, we see progressive democratization, inclusion of human rights in the amended constitution. And also, I mentioned earlier, there were tensions during this debate, but the nationalists won. And then during the time of Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, and it's 10 years, which means half of the whole period after 1998, it was the president was Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, and I think that's a very important period. Some of the consequences of the policies in that time we can still see today. Well, the picture over there is of a book published by ISEAS, which is very excellent, I think, which looks published after Yudhoyono stepped down from the president. And there was one chapter looking at Yudhoyono's policy on religion. So some of the characteristics is that during this 10-year period, there is political emphasis on political stability and less progressive reforms. And then emphasis on moderation, on harmony, less than human rights, and more accommodation of Islam. One of the examples is accommodations of the Conservative Indonesian Council of Ulama, or Majelis Ulama Indonesia, MUI. And it is in this time, in this 10-year period of Yudhoyono, you see, well, actually MUI is the Indonesian Council of Ulama is actually just a non-governmental organizations, just like many other Islamic non-governmental organizations. But, and it was established actually during the time of Suharto. But now, during the time of Yudhoyono, they became much more strengthened. And in two laws, there is a mention of this Majlis Ulama, and there is one on the Islamic economy, the law on Islamic economy, and then the law on protections of halal product. There is a mention of Majlis Ulama Indonesia. So they have somehow get a strengthened legal status through this law. It is actually, other than that, it's a conservative organization, moderate but conservative. So, and then we see after Yudhoyono stepped down, some of the consequences of policies in this period Jokowi had to deal with. The first term of Joko Widodo, so when Joko Widodo, we know, most of you I'm sure know, when Joko Widodo came in 2014, he was regarded as a symbol of democracy against his rival, Prabowo, who was regarded as carrying the remnants of the Indonesian authoritarian past during the time of Suharto. And he won, Jokowi won. And then we see that he pays so much attention on economy, especially on infrastructure, and did not pay much attention to issues related to rule of law, to human rights, including on religion. He seems like he saw this as not important. But that changed after 2016. At the end of 2016, there was these huge mass demonstrations against the Jakarta governor, Basuki Cahaya Purnama, or Ahok, better known as Ahok. And this is actually the largest mass mobilizations after 1998. And people were surprised, where did these groups come from? Actually, they were nurtured during the 10 years of the Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono's president. It was seen as harmless, but now in 2016, they show this street politics became more important, and that made Jokowi worried. And how to deal with it? Starting 2017, we see again this strategy which I mentioned earlier. the mix between repression and accommodation. Repressions of groups regarded as radical, I have to put quote unquote there because, again, who are the radicals? That is not always clear. And accommodation, and the group which is accommodated is the moderate religious groups supporting the government and also fighting radicalism. So we see, starting in 2017, some repressive measures toward these groups regarded as radical, like, for example, the banning of Hizbut Tahrir Indonesia. This group came into existence after 1998. They could not exist during the time of Suharto. They came after 1998. And then now, during the, by Jokowi banned that. It's basically, it's anti-democracy, although it's non-violent. But that was banned. And then the police also started to use more and more restrictive laws and regulations. Some with political targets. There can be debate about this, but this is an observation by many people. And then also, like, for example, there's also regulations reducing freedom, especially freedom of expression among the civil servants. Even recently, there is a regulations controlling some of the grassroots religious groups, the Majlis Ta'lim, for example. So these are some of the repressive measures. So to look into more detail, these two strategies, first, the repression. The repression is done in the name of fighting radicalism. And with that, it gained sympathy, even among, especially among the moderate Muslim groups. And it is, we can see it very clearly in October 2019, when the president picked formed his new cabinet. He mentions 3 ministries, which he gave a special mandate of fighting radicalism: the Ministry of Religious Affairs, the Ministry of Domestic Affairs, and the coordinating Ministry of Politics, Law, and Security. This is very, very strong statement, I think. And then, how do you fight radicalism? In many regulations and in the national strategy against radicalism, 2 things are mentioned. First, strengthening the national ideology of Pancasila, and then secondly, also strengthening the moderate religion. Like, for example, the Ministry of Religious Affairs produced a book with the title Moderate Religion, or Moderasi Beragama in Bahasa Indonesia. And it is being promoted nationwide. The drawback of this strategy is that, well, many people now criticize this counter-radicalization strategy, not because they don't believe that there is a radicalism problem in Indonesia. I think this is clear, that there is the radicalization problem. But making this as a main policy instrument makes it clouded with short-term political objectives. So sometimes people also see that it's not only to fight radicalism, but also to silence some of the groups which are critical to the government. It is interesting, like, for example, last year there was also a big issue, the big demonstrations in September 2019. One of the reasons was because of the new regulations, which was regarded as weakening the anti-commission corruption. And the anti-commission, the anti-corruption commission is really the son or the daughter of democratization. So it's very important. The big demonstration, and to justify the new regulation, for example, the government doesn't mention it explicitly, but the public discourse around this weakening of the Anti-Corruption Commission was that the members of the commissions were some of them were considered as radical, and that's why it has to be controlled. So this is just one example of how the counter-radicalization measures are used to also target some political, short-term political objectives. In terms of the accommodation, it's clear that the accommodations is of moderate religions. I mentioned earlier the Ministry of Religious Affairs producing a book with the title Moderate Religion, which is now being campaigned nationwide. And then of Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah, the two largest and oldest Islamic organizations. And very important, I think, is again the Majlis Ulama Indonesia. I mentioned earlier that this was actually established only in 1975. It was established by Suharto, but now it has become much stronger. Especially, more particularly, it became stronger during the time of Yudhoyono, but now the vice president is someone who is the head of the National Council of Ulama until today, actually. Officially, he's still the head of the Majlis Ulama. So we see these are the groups which are being accommodated. And in that way, Jokowi is not seen as against Islam when he repressed certain Muslim groups, because he also accommodates these other groups. What are the impacts of this mixed strategy of repression and accommodation? At least in the short term, it probably produced stability needed for development. But what we have seen, especially during the presidential election, and it seems that it still also continue until now, is the strengthening of the religious polarization. And this may be dangerous, especially during the time of the elections. And don't forget that we have, across Indonesia, more than 500 elections. The presidential elections and then the local elections in 34 provinces and more than 500 districts. So in all these elections, sometimes when needed, religious polarization is exploited by politicians. Another impact, which is I think very central, is the decline of democracy. The trend of democracy, according to Freedom House, I'm using the data from Freedom House, is steady progress since 1998. But then, starting 2014, there is stagnation and even decline. So I show you quickly here the table from Freedom House Index of Democracy. And you can see the first row is the overall status. Before 1998, Indonesia was not free. And then 1998, there was democratizations. And then partly free between 1999 to 2005, and then free between 2006 to 2013, and then in the past 5 years, it came back again to partly free. And you can see the rating there, but what has declined in the past 5 years actually is in terms of civil liberties. And when you look more closely at what are the indicators for civil liberties, Indonesia is regarded as highest on free press, academic freedom, and individual freedom of expression, but lowest in the areas of freedom of expression and belief and rule of law. So like, for example, one question in this index is, are individuals free to practice and express their religious faith or non-belief in public and private? So the answers to that question, it's declining in the past 5 years. It's still good. Much better compared to the before 1998, for sure. But there is stagnation or even decline. So my last two slides. So what is the prospect of the in the coming few years? Will Indonesia be politically stable? I think the answer is, in general, yes. But there is a possibility of more disappointments. I show the picture of Tempo magazine, which actually I just found it outside there during the break. So Tempo every December it picked Man of the Year or Woman of the Year, but this year it's People of the Year, and the People of the Year was the dissidents. These are the students who went to the streets in September 2019. That is after the victory of Jokowi, but before the appointment of the new ministers. And it is interesting to compare that with the People of the Year in 2014. And they were the volunteers. And many of the volunteers were volunteers for Jokowi, which helped Jokowi to win. But now we have dissidents against Jokowi. And I think many of the dissidents were previously supporters of Jokowi. And we can see until now, it's been more than 2 months after the second term. The disappointments voiced in September 2019 demonstrations have not been well addressed. Two of them is the weakening, what is seen as the weakening of the Anti-Corruption Commission, and then the revisions of the draft penal code. It's not yet made official. There will still be discussion about it, but so far there has not been progress in this area. And then the development and economy may continue improving. I cannot say more than that. That's Ibu Mari Pangestu to say. But the quality of democracy may decline even further. In the fight against radicalism, there are more rhetorics of patriotism and moderate religion, but also restrictions, partly justified in the name of countering radicalizations. What will happen beyond 2024? Well, of course, we don't know. I mean, there are many factors, but the trend of religious polarizations may continue. We have seen it strengthen during the presidential election. And elections have been a polarizing force, and politicians may be tempted to manipulate religion, ethnic identities when they feel the need to do so, when there is a fierce competitions and they lack more capitals than sometimes as has happened in the national elections of the parliamentary members as well as the presidential election and also the local elections. When there was a fierce competitions, then sometimes these religious sentiments are used by the politicians. So we'll see what happens in 2024. It will depend on who will be the candidates, whether it will be polarizing or not. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zainal. So let me quickly open the floor for question. I believe that there are many food for thought, and there are many interesting issues that we can discuss. So please identify yourself, your affiliation, and please keep your question succinct.
My name is Manasano. I'm from ISEAS. I have two questions for Dr. Zainal. First, we on the outside of Indonesia hear a lot of commentary about intolerant Islam in Indonesia. But I wonder if you could tell us about trends toward anti-Islamic sentiments and intolerance of Islam in Indonesian society, especially among Indonesian Christians. The second question I have for
I'm sorry, trend toward anti-Islamic?
That's right.
Okay.
Intolerance of Islam among Indonesian Christians, and how much of a factor you think this might be in this polarization. The second question I have is just to ask you to elaborate more on these dissidents that Tempo called attention to, and what the profile of these people who supported Jokowi in the past and then turned against him is. Thank you.
Any other question? We collect a few questions first. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Raymond. I'm from DHL Express. I have a question for Professor Mari Pangestu. You talked about the ambitious reforms for Pak Jokowi's administration. Having been someone from the inside, I'd just like to understand from your perception as whether there's enough political will to actually undertake that reform, especially in the midst of strong domestic pressures for protectionism in Indonesia, and we've seen a lot of backtracking on the negative list, the investment negative list, end of last year. So, any insights you can give as to whether Pak Jokowi can actually implement those ambitious reforms would be good.
Okay. Yes.
Yaqub Ibrahim from Singapore Institute of Technology for Dr. Zainal. I'm just curious about external events and its impact on Indonesian Muslims. It's been rather silent from Indonesia on the issues of Xinjiang or the Rohingyas, Kashmir, and so on and so forth. It doesn't seem to be a factor. Am I missing something there? Thank you.
Any other question? Okay, let's.
Sorry, from over here.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. Emirza from RSIS. I want to ask about the appointment of retired General Fahrul Razi as Minister of Religious Affairs. That seems to reinforce this picture of nationalist versus Islamist factions in Indonesia. And it's also put into question the relationship between Jokowi, his Vice President Ma'ruf Amin, and NU, because the appointment decries by NU. So how do you observe the relationship between Jokowi and his Vice President and the largest religious organization in Indonesia? Thank you.
Okay. Maybe we can start answering this question from.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much for the questions. First. Yes, it's unfortunate. I mean, an interesting demography, religious demography in Indonesia is that although Indonesia has been called as a majority Islamic country, majority Muslim country, but you can also see that the Muslims are not majority in all parts of Indonesia. So like, for example, in Eastern Indonesia, the majority is Christian. And Muslims are minority. So the intolerance in Java, for example, toward the constructions of houses of worship of churches, so intolerance of Christians among Muslims in Java, that bring impacts in other parts of Indonesia. Not all parts of Eastern Indonesia, but you can see in Papua, for example, there was a case in 2015 of a mosque which was burned by the majority Christian population in that area. And then you can also see, like in Kupang, there has been a big movement against the building of a mosque there, which now is done. And then also places like Manado, which is very harmonious, actually. But there were also, we have to admit, there were also Christian militia there, something like FPI in Jakarta, but they were not very active. But when things get bad in Java, then it seems like it's activate this sentiment. So, and that's why it is. I think it's very important to deal seriously with intolerance. I think the problem of intolerance is much more important than the problem of radicalism or terrorism. Of course, terrorism kills. Intolerance probably does not kill. But, in the long term, it poses not less serious threats. And then secondly, about the dissidents. Who are the dissidents? Well, the student demonstrations, you can see, those university students who went to the streets, probably in 1998 they were just born or 1 year old. That is one group among the dissidents, but the other group is the disappointed activists who supported Jokowi in 2014, or who were probably neutral, activists of some human rights and democracy movement. You can also see that in terms of the campaign toward Golput. Golput is what is the English? The non-voting the campaign not to vote for any of the candidates because of the disappointment, I think mostly because of the disappointments of Jokowi. So Jokowi in 2014 was regarded as symbol of democracy, but not in 2019. So I think mostly it consists of these two groups. But the people you see on the streets, most of them were students. The issue of Xinjiang, this is a big issue indeed. A few months, I think in June, there was already a report published by IPAC Institute. I don't exactly remember. It's led by Sidney Jones, exactly asking that questions. Why has Indonesia been silent? Part of the problem, I think, was that the issue of Xinjiang, just like the issue of Palestine, has been used by the hardline conservative radical groups. And when they use a certain issue, they use it from their platform as opposition to the government. So they criticize the government, why the government doesn't do anything, etc. And then the government has reacted to that and trying, well, the situation actually is not as bad as you think, something like that. So China government has invited many members of NU, Muhammadiyah and others, and then they came back and then they said basically the issue is not as bad as that. Yeah, so there was a big controversy about that 2 weeks ago. There was a report in New York Times, I think, exactly noting that trend. And then the last question about Fakhrul Razi. I think this is what I call as the worry about the strengthening of the religious polarization. It seems like it strengthened the nationalist versus Islamist poles or divisions, and I think the worst thing about appointing Fakhrul Razi was not because he's a nationalist, but he's a military. He's from military background, and day one when he speaks as a minister of religion, he speaks more. It seems like he was more a military than a minister of religious affairs. So he says, "I will crush the radicals. I will do this and that." And that is, and with very minimum, and I would say misled understanding about what radicalism is. So I think this is not good even to do counter radicalization. The last one, the relationship between Jokowi and Ma'ruf Amin. Well, I don't know. I mean, we have to speculate, but I think they have some kind of divisions of jobs. I mean, Ma'ruf Amin deals with the issue of the Islamic economy, halal product, etc., and then Jokowi will deal with the rest. So both are happy as long as the others don't step on the others' toes. Thank you.
Yes, a question was asked about the reality of the ambitious reforms that is being planned, given the current situation of rather anti-protectionism, and I would say, of course, institutionally and politically, the situation at home, domestically. So I think, as someone who has been on the inside, passing laws that you have to do, if you want to pass a law properly, it is actually very time-consuming, because you actually have to do a lot of homework and get all the stakeholders in line, do your proper mapping and socialization, and I passed a few laws in my time, and actually the biggest resistance came more within the cabinet rather than from outside. And even after you pass the law, other cabinet members would pass other laws that were actually inconsistent with the first law that you passed. So I think there has to be not just strong political will, but I think there has to be an understanding of, why are we doing all this, and where is it going, and which laws are going to be more difficult than others to change. And as far as I can tell, the hardest one to change, and it has always been the one that was hardest to change, because even in 2004, we had this on our reform agenda and we didn't succeed, which is the labor law. And the labor law from the private sector perspective is the one that they are waiting for. There are two that matter the most to them. One is the labor law and the other one is the tax reforms. I have more optimism that the tax reforms would be passed, because the finance ministry has been working on it for the last 2 years, and there's already a draft that was completed at the end of last year, and it was very much socialized with the private sector. And you're only talking about one ministry being involved and one commission in the parliament that they have to deal with mainly. So I'm, at least on the tax reform, but I would say on tax reform, it can't just be what they are doing on the changing of the laws. They have to also improve the institutions that are going to be collecting the law and the system, the electronic system. For a big country like Indonesia, we do not have an electronic system yet that connects you to your identity and so on and so forth. And this is, I think, the key to me is always about system and technology, how technology today can actually help you to create better system, better transparency. So they have to do this in parallel, otherwise it may not have the desired effect. On all the other laws, I'm just afraid that it's very, very ambitious, because you're talking about, I think there are like maybe 12 or 14 ministries involved, and basically you have to involve all the 11 commissions of the parliament, right? And even if you have majority, this government has majority in parliament, who's to say that the parliament is going to go along and support what the government wants? I haven't been able to figure out what kind of game plan they have for getting the parliament to pass it, because the idea is that you're going to have these like 84 laws and 1,000 whatever articles all being packaged as changes in 84 laws, which will involve all the commissions, which will involve X number of ministers, and you're supposed to pass this all at once. And I mean, the idea is a good idea in the sense that you want to do it quickly, because we don't have time to do this. But maybe what will happen, and what I've heard just recently is that the most difficult one, turns out as expected, is the labor law. So I think maybe at the end of the day, you might take pieces of it instead of just doing everything all at once. But perhaps they have 11 clusters after all. Maybe that you do it cluster by cluster. But even if you did it cluster by cluster, there are two main issues that you have to deal with. One is getting the parliamentary support. Even if you have a majority, you still have to do all the lobbying and the management of the support and so on and so forth. And believe me, my experience passing laws, that is very time consuming and a lot of work, a lot of effort. And I think the other thing is what they want to do. I forgot to mention that it's not just about amending the laws and the regulations. They want to also have the implementing regulations also come out at the same time, because that is also the learning process that I had. I thought, I passed the law, I passed the investment law, and I thought, okay, great, I've done my job, I've achieved it. And then it turns out it took another like 3 years to come up with all the implementing regulations, which are still problematic up to today. So the implementing regulations is actually where you will have a lot of challenge, and you will have a lot of issues with regional governments, and I also worry a little about the they're trying to correct inconsistencies, but maybe you'll create more inconsistencies if you're not careful, and if in the bargaining in the parliament, you don't get what you want, then you get something else, and then it turns out to be inconsistent with that. So I can see it's a very, very complex, very big issue, but I think the intention is there. So perhaps, if you couldn't, that's plan A. Plan B would be to do it by cluster. Plan C is to try to do it by cluster, and at the same time, you create a unit, this is another thing they're trying to do, a unit I think it's under Minister Luhut, as well as Minister Erlangga, to solve problems for investors as they come up, so that at least you're facilitating the issues and problems and hoping to create certainty. So that would be a plan, the hybrid plan that I think if you were pragmatic, that's how you would approach it. On facing anti-protection and so on, I think this is just a political issue that will never go away. It's an underlying thing in Indonesia, maybe not just Indonesia, many other countries. Nationalism, we want to make everything domestic. We want to have, we don't want to import. We want to export, but we don't want to import. Yeah, and this kind of thinking needs to, we as economists, we try very hard to explain, but somehow it's the current thinking is still very anti-import, and the political rhetoric is also very anti-import. Whereas if you really want to be part of the global value chain, you want to have talent, foreign talent, come and develop your creative industries or your digital hubs, you need foreign talent. Gojek even doesn't have enough talent at home, so they have to go and buy a company in Bangalore to do all the backroom development. So, our openness to this kind of thing is important. It's important to get that breakthrough. Otherwise, the desired quality of investment that you want will not come, and your ability to address human capital and technological change will also only happen much more slowly. So these are some of the challenges in the mindset, and on top of what I think was an excellent presentation just then on the issue of religion and democracy. So we're a complex country. But I think we're still going to continue to grow around 5% for the foreseeable future, and hopefully we can grow higher if we can begin to get some of these things right. Thank you.
I think with that, I think we have learned a lot from this panel, and let's give a big applause for our panelists.